Hey everyone, this is Chess Teacher Tui. I decided to do something a little different today. Instead of showing a tactical position or an endgame, I'm making a video of a full game between Jose Raul Capablanca and the amateur Mark Fonaroff. Fonaroff was a Russian violin instructor. He came over to New York at the early 20th century, and this was a casual game. He happened to play against Capablanca, which got published. Now, although this is a game where someone who would become a world champion in a few years was crushing an amateur, it's still extremely instructional. Capablanca is one of the greatest chess talents who ever lived, maybe the greatest chess talent, definitely one of the chess titans of the Western Hemisphere. But he's still known for playing two as close as you can get perfect chess. I mean, his chess was almost entirely blunder and mistake free, and he was called the chess machine, and his play in both the middle game and the end game is famous for its logic, its simplicity, its efficiency. And this game, this crushing win, is an excellent example of that. So we're going to go there and see what lessons we can extract from this extremely instructional game. So Capablanca plays e4, black plays e5, knight f3, knight c6, nothing new here. Bishop b5. Now, the game score of this game is disputed. Some people have this game starting as a scotch with d4, d6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop b5. Uh, but regardless of which version of the game score you have, uh, they end up in the same position after white makes his fifth move. So I'm going to go from this way, the Spanish version. So bishop b5, black plays knight f6, the Berlin defense. He castles, and then black plays d6. This is the old Steinitz variation of the Ruy Lopez, the Spanish game. Now, with this move, all moves in chess have pluses and minuses. So I think all of the first moves were pretty straightforward, but this is one where now we have to really consider the character of the position. So we see that black has his e-pawn, and his e-pawn is now reinforced by both this d-pawn and by, of course, the knight on c6. Now, because of that, uh, black has tried to solidify and make much more secure his center, but he's also created a problem for himself. Now, this diagonal is open. This bishop now, by being on this diagonal, pins the black knight, and in addition to that, and more importantly perhaps, is that black's king's bishop is now greatly limited by that d6 pawn. And fianchettoing, putting out the g pawn and then putting the bishop on g7, that really wouldn't help that much either, because that same e5 pawn would still be limiting its scope and its effectiveness. So the move has a lot of pluses and minuses, but that's the main reason why this move has gone out of favor. Now, because of this, because of the semi-closed position, Capablanca sees an opportunity to try to get an advantage just by getting his pieces out more quickly. Now, as you can see, white already has two active pieces and a semi-active piece in the rook. He's got the bishop, the knight, and then, of course, the rook, which can go to e1. And black only has the two knights out. So with the limited position of the king's bishop, white has an opportunity to try to get a developmental advantage. So Capablanca is going to try to get things open quickly. Capa plays d4, and here black can choose to take the d-pawn right away, but it seems almost a waste because the whole point of this d6 move was to solidify that pawn, so taking might not be what he wants. Black plays bishop to d7. He's going into what's called the hedgehog. And white plays knight to b3. Now, Stockfish also suggests d5 as a strong alternative. But a lot of the masters from the International Chess School, they don't particularly like this move because it closes the center, and in their mind, it negates some of the time advantage that white already has. So it depends on what kind of advantage you want to play for, but that's their reasoning. So Capablanca plays knight c3, and then black plays bishop e7, so that black can now be free to castle. Now, in this position, Capablanca recognizes that he is in a position where he could very easily win a pawn if black does not play wisely. So Capablanca plays rook e1, and the reason why he plays rook e1 is, let's say, for example, that black makes sort of a careless move, a move just out of habit, and just castles immediately now that he's able to. What black may or may not realize is, by not taking the steps here to keep the material even, he's actually going to go down a pawn after bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, queen takes queen, rook takes queen, and knight takes e5. So in this position, Capablanca has a good understanding of the dynamics of the center, and so by playing rook e1, it really forces black to take immediately onto d4. And by making him take immediately on d4, he's opening up the center and trying to take advantage of the superior mobility of his pieces. So knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, bishop takes b5, knight takes b5, and black castles. So, as you can see, the quality of white's pieces are slightly better. One might have a little trepidation, because one might think, well, isn't the queen out before the queen should be out? I mean, normally you want to wait to bring the queen out, but in this position, black is not in a position to win a lot of tempi off of the queen. So because of that, it's okay. Now, at the International Chess School, one of the things they always say that we should be doing is to do this thing called the to-do list, which is to make notes about characteristics of the position and then look for things to do. One of the things that they note on the to-do list is the c7 pawn is now attacked by white's knight. It's also defended once. So one of the things to keep in mind is that if white were to attack this pawn, being that it's attacked once, defended once already, he could try to win a tempo off the pawn. Interestingly enough, the suggested move for black in this position, according to Stockfish, is actually to play c6, which is after knight takes bishop. The recommended move by Stockfish is actually c6. But black castles, and Capablanca is going to make a simple but really, really strong move here. And again, it's one of those things where it just seems like a normal move, but when you look at it in hindsight, it's a move that's just really incredibly strong. And I'm going to give you a moment to try to find this move, to find white's simple, and again, it's not winning, it doesn't win material, but it's just this simple move that accomplishes so much at once. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to pause the video to see if you can find white's next move. Okay, Capablanca here moves queen to c3. And the reason why this move is so good is it just does so many things at once. The first thing it does, of course, is it double attacks onto c7. And by doing that, that now forces black to respond somehow to that threat, so it wins a tempo. But it does more than that. It also vacates the square d4 for the knight to travel, and also to try to get to f5, which is where Capablanca wants to bring his knight. Also, what it does is, by moving the queen to the third rank, you now see that the queen has superior mobility to go to either the king side or the queen side, so that Capablanca can deploy his pieces to attack on either side of the board. So Capablanca is accomplishing quite a few things at once here, and in so doing, he is really just taking advantage of his space and his mobility. So black here plays c6, which of course is to solidify that pawn and also to kick the knight off of b5. Now, interestingly enough, one of the things I considered was I thought to myself, why not c5? If black were to go to c5, it would keep knight off of the d4 square and keep him from being able to redeploy to f5 immediately. But the problem with that move, hopefully you already see it already, is not only does it create a permanent hole on d5, which could be a really huge problem later on, an ideal square for the knight to get defended on that d5 square, but what it also does is it creates a permanent weakness and a backwards pawn onto d6. So black's choice of c6 is better than c5. So white is forced to move. Capablanca goes to d4. And here, Stockfish prefers g6. It really does not want that knight to get on to f5, but Fonaroff instead plays knight to d7. So I'm going to stop the video here just for the purposes of time, and we are going to continue in part 2.